Right now, we're about to have a debate, the main event, so to speak, on national industrial policy. Well, with us today to talk through this is Scott Lincecum. Scott is a senior fellow in economic studies at the Cato Institute. Brian Riley, who is the director of the National Tax Foundation or National Taxpayers Union's Free Trade Initiative. And Oren Cass is the executive director of American Compass and author of author of The Once and Future Worker, A Vision for the Renewal of Work in America, and a contributing opinion writer for the Financial Times. And helming this conversation today is Stephen Kent. Stephen is a public relations consultant. He's a host of a popular podcast that explores the sort of socio-political implications of Star Wars. He also has a forthcoming book on the topic, on that broad topic. And he's the host of Right Now, a new YouTube show that focuses on the current happenings on the political right and the conservative movement. Again, as with the last panel, if you have questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to get to those in the last few minutes of today's panel. But otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen to kick things off. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
All right, thanks, Jared, and good afternoon, and welcome everybody to the final program of the day, titled National Industrial Policy, Fortune or Folly. Like Jared said, my name is Stephen Kent, and I'm going to serve in the role of moderator for this discussion with the goal of clarifying terms of debate early and getting us all closer to an understanding of what is actually at issue in the renewed discourse over whether the U.S. should promote a national industrial policy. I'm going to show my hand at the beginning here by offering to the audience and the panelists that I am not an expert on this subject, nor do I have a particularly strong opinion about which way we should go. I'm familiar with both sides of the argument. I've heard all of you speak who are on the panel, and presented unchallenged, I think a lot of the arguments any of you make sense and appeal to my conflicting desires for U.S. policy to A, not distort market signals or prop up well-connected insiders, and B, on the other hand, to not have the U.S. bury its head in the sand while our rivals aggressively reshape the global balance of economic and military power in the world, not to mention the literal rising tide of climate change and the challenges that it presents in the years ahead. Again, our esteemed panelists today are Scott Lincecum of Cato, Brian Riley of the National Taxpayers Union, and Oren Cass of American Compass. My challenge to the panelists today, especially considering we are, I believe, in a 2-on-1 situation here, and you've engaged one another on this debate in the past, is to convince me of your position. Is pursuing a U.S. national industrial policy key to fortune or folly for the U.S.? And I want to start with Oren. Oren, in talking to some of the pro-industrial policy types, national conservatives and the likes, I feel like industrial policy is slipping into the meme about Kristen Gillibrand and infrastructure, which is to say that it is everything and anything you want it to be. Would you agree to the following definition and limitation of industrial policy? Industrial policy is having the federal government promote for nationalistic motives using regulation, taxation, and/or trade policy, plus investments with certain sectors of the economy and industries to achieve a present national goal.
I think so. Generally, I would say there are a lot more tools of policy we might use to do that. So just as an example, education policy could focus heavily on a particular industry, but broadly, I'd say that would be a good definition.
Scott, Brian, I want to turn it over to y'all. How would you like to add or modify that so we know what we're talking about?
Yeah, Brian, if you don't mind, I'll start. But before I begin, Stephen, since I'm having to convince you, really like the jacket. It's very sharp. So I think that's close. I think a couple elements that I would add, however, is one, industrial policy historically, if you look back at the academic record, at the historical debate, policy implementation is about picking specific sectors or specific industries in mainly the manufacturing sector. So industrial policy does not say we need to impose a flat carbon tax to fight climate change. It says we need to boost the domestic renewables industry in the United States to fight climate change. The second thing that I think is critically important is that industrial policy is based on the idea of achieving outcomes, national objectives that are better than what the market can produce. That is, I think, also extremely important, because frequently when you hear about industrial policy, you hear about technological spillovers and positive externalities and these types of things. And importantly, that these are attempting to correct for market failures, to improve upon what the market does, which is admittedly messy, but I think we can all agree generally does a pretty decent job.
Can I get Brian to respond to particularly Oren's suggestion that it could include education policy? What do you make of that inclusion into the definition of industrial policy? Because I feel like that's been brought up in the context of infrastructure as well.
I totally agree with him, but part of it is just a choice of how Stephen, you want to just define industrial policy, whether it's very narrow and targeted on specific policies directed to specific industries, or whether it's more broad. But certainly any policy designed to boost American manufacturing, American industries, has got to include a good education system. The definition of industrial policy that I like, which is not the one I think we're going to discuss here today, is that the role of the government is to provide a good environment for which businesses can operate, reasonable regulations. We're not going to tax you to death. We're not going to have big budget deficits. It requires borrowing from other countries and domestically. We're going to have a strong education system. If that's the definition of industrial policy, then I'm wholeheartedly behind it. But I think when most people talk of industrial policy, they tend to be more along the lines of the definition that you described, and I appreciate you defining that up front. Also, before I forget, I just wanted to thank the Charles Koch Institute for putting on this series of events. It's very timely, and appreciate them obviously leaving the most impressive panelists and most important panel to the end. And I know some of the others are watching. And to those who think I'm dressed like a slob here in my t-shirt, I just want to be clear, I dressed specifically for this. My t-shirt, which I purchased from Amazon. So my favorite t-shirt. So I like the idea of having an open mind to what industrial policy should be, that it should be more than just we're going to pick this industry or that company. But I think, and I don't want to go on too long, but we already have an industrial policy, right? We pay in America twice the world price for sugar. So if you're a candy manufacturer, you might want to move to Mexico or to Canada so you can get sugar at a reasonable price and be competitive. Why is that? Because Florida is a pretty politically powerful state. We put corn in our gas tanks. Is that because of any, rational reason? Well, I'm not an expert, but I think really it just boils down to Iowa's the first presidential primary state, and they have a lot of political clout. We have tariffs on steel and aluminum that make it harder for U.S. manufacturers to compete. So I think we already have an industrial policy, and it's one that is counterproductive, not one that's helping us.
Oren, I imagine you object to that.
Well, I agree with Brian's point that we have an industrial policy. I think it's actually an important way of thinking about the topic, which is that you almost, I suppose, in some sort of libertarian ideal that doesn't exist anywhere in the world, there might be no industrial policy. But in this world, there is industrial policy. And obviously our trading partners have it. And many of the policy choices we make reflected as well. And I think Brian sort of has, if you had your bingo card for today's event, you can already check off sugar subsidies and ethanol right off the bat. So you may be well on your way. But one could just as easily, of course, point out that we have COVID vaccines because of an industrial policy. I mean, the US, and I'm not speaking specifically about Operation Warp Speed, I'm speaking about the very intentional policy choice over decades to disproportionately fund research and development in bioscience, to aggressively fund and subsidize PhDs and other medical programs for professions in that industry, to create a guaranteed high price buyer of whatever innovations are created through our Medicare system in particular. And those, again, are all intentional policy choices that we do for the healthcare industry specifically, because we recognize that the value associated with investment and innovation in healthcare is particularly large, and that the social value is particularly larger than what the market might generate on its own. And so I certainly will agree with Scott and Brian in every case that there are abuses, and industrial policy is not perfect. But I think if one is sort of stacking up the examples, one quickly realizes that actually having a public policy perspective on the value of different forms of investment, and making sure that our public policy puts a pretty heavy thumb on the scale for some of them, has proven and will continue to be, I think, really beneficial.
Scott, I'd like to get COVID-19 checked off for main topics of what counts as industrial policy. Is the production of a vaccine for distribution worldwide and domestically fit into your wheelhouse of industrial policy?
Yeah, I don't think so. Well, let me put it this way. I think that there's certainly, you can say, look, we have a patent system in place. We have a long-term funding for public health, which is, of course, a very legitimate government area. Unlike, say, commercializing semiconductors, that is radically different from, again, what we think of as traditional industrial policy, picking a product, picking an industry, and saying we need to be world beating in that, and we're going to do it through targeted non-market interventions that are going to beat out the market. Now, if you look at Operation Warp Speed,
before you keep going, can I just ask, is that what you just described, is that or is that not, in your view, what we do in healthcare?
How so?
Well, you just described pick a sector, have aggressive non-market interventions in it.
Yeah, you have funding for basic research, and then, of course, a massive state side on the demand side. But again, trying to say that is traditional industrial policy, and saying that there is a legitimate government role in outside of the public health sector, I think, are both really a bridge, two bridges too far. But going beyond that, I mean, look, if you look at Operation Warp Speed in a vacuum, if you look at the vaccines in a vacuum, without, of course, considering the private market alternative being the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine, which was developed without significant government support for R&D, which may have actually been impeded by Operation Warp Speed. Certainly there was a guaranteed purchase contract, but that was just simply for the production of finished doses. It had, of course, some basic research funding, but actually started out not with research funding for mRNA, and there's a lot of back and forth about how that technology actually emerged. If you look at that alternative, you see that there's not a lot of industrial policy going on here. That yes, Pfizer benefited from a wonderful patent regime here in the United States, if you like the patent regime. But at the end of the day, you did not have the government picking winners. You didn't have, I think the alternate case would be a Moderna, where there is a strict government public-private partnership. However, beyond Moderna, you also have Emergent Biosolutions, which is far more connected to the government via contracts and was handling the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Emergent, however, has come under, as some people might know, a lot of scrutiny, and they've had to throw away millions of doses. Now, just imagine for a second if that were our model, which I think is far more the traditional industrial policy model.
What I am hearing here is, so we keep talking about like the old world definition of industrial policy versus this new world, which is changing rapidly, both by technological innovation and also by, and COVID-19 was an example of just where the world hits you over the face and you have to respond accordingly. Oren, this is my concern with industrial policy as a concept, is that everything is changing so quickly that as soon as you implement some sort of industrial policy, a commitment to a certain industry or sector, the technology will change. Our needs will evolve faster than we can even keep up with in a way that we might not have in the mid-20th century. What are your thoughts on that and setting a policy in a world that is constantly changing when the government doesn't do very good at responding quickly to change?
Well, look, I think there are two things to be said about that. One is that we will certainly get a lot of things wrong, but that the goal of industrial policy is not to bat 1,000. That, you know, the share of whether you're talking about medical breakthroughs or DARPA breakthroughs or, the incredible range of modern technologies that we have, virtually all of which start at some point with either defense or government research, not to mention the massive subsidies we give to our higher education system. I'm sure for every one of those, you could list 10 or 100 things that prove not to be very good ideas. So the definition of success isn't that you get everything right. And I think it was Scott who said this, the definition of success is that you improve upon what we would have if we merely left things up to the market. And so I think the question is whether are there areas that we can be confident we are going to get less than the right level of investment or less than the level of investment we would want to have if there's no role for public policy in making investment in those areas or attracting investment to those areas.
I want to give Brian the opportunity to respond to this idea of sort of the batting average and if it's acceptable for government to swing and miss that many times.
Yeah, well, I think there's always a danger, Stephen, that discussions like this will devolve into anecdotes. Brian mentions the sugar program. Somebody else mentions Airbus. Somebody else mentions Solyndra. But I think you can learn from those. So I'm going to throw out another anecdote. I spend probably too much time on Twitter, but this is something that caught my eye. I'm going to share. This is a picture of the 1957 Hindustan Ambassador automobile. This is the 2011 Hindustan Ambassador automobile. This is the 2014 Hindustan Ambassador automobile. And that is in India, which has had a much stronger industrial policy. And if I look in the United States, why are auto manufacturers so strong? It's because, well, the government has certainly done things to step in, sometimes in an ill-advised way, I would assert. It's because we had the opportunity as consumers to buy Toyotas and to buy Hondas and for them to manufacture here and employ Americans and bring their manufacturing techniques and their worker training techniques. So I think those tend to be much more successful than industrial policies. And the other question I often have when I hear people talking about industrial policies, and you raised the key one to me, which is what does it even mean? I like to know what's the problem that you're shooting at? Because a lot of times it seems like, well, we don't manufacture enough, so we've got to have an industrial policy. And that's just confusing to me because our manufacturing output heading into COVID was extremely strong in terms of output. Now, we didn't have a lot of employment in manufacturing. It had been going down for the last 10 years after the last recession. It was rebounding and going back up.
Brian, maybe we could put a pin in it here and have Oren define the problem as he sees it succinctly, because the whole idea of like China is one of the instigating threats is that they have caught up with the rest of the world rather than surpassed necessarily.
Stephen, before we move on, can I just add one quick thing, if I may? On I think there are 2 points that Oren raised before Brian went that are really critical. First is this is the idea that basic research, government funding for basic research, or that anything that government funding ever touches tangentially is results. Any technology that's an industrial policy success is part of, I think, the problem in this debate. I mean, if you look at some of the examples that are out there, whether it's the iPhone or the internet, these are not in any way what I would call traditional industrial policy, which I think is, again, the government setting out broad strategic objectives and then trying to pick industries and fund specific market-beating technologies for commercial purposes. But the second issue on the BAT 1000 thing, industrial policy advocates have a habit of pointing to a success in industrial policy without ever considering all of the unseen costs that go into the government allocating those resources, whether it's opportunity costs or indirect costs or moral hazard or the rest. And you don't have an empirical analysis of that. And thus what you end up with is, aha, we funded one Tesla, totally ignoring all of the distortions that have been created and totally ignoring kind of the broader cost of that project, including the portfolio cost of the program itself. And I think if you don't actually look at those things, if you don't consider them, then the debate becomes, like we said, it's just pointing out anecdotes.
Oren?
Yeah, well, I guess I would briefly just want to pick up on the automaker example. I mean, I think it's important to underscore that Japanese firms came to the United States to manufacture cars thanks to, according to New York Times, quote, Ronald Reagan's state-directed trade policy, noting that instead of flooding America with cars made at home and risking new protectionist measures, the Japanese are going native, opening up American plants. And so, you know, I think this sort of the Japanese competition in the 80s, it's important to remember, resulted in aggressive measures that I believe even Scott and Brian would agree qualify as industrial policy in areas including auto and semiconductors, both of which then led to a very different picture in this country in the 1990s and beyond. And so, you know, to the question of, I won't even remember, what's the question that it got thrown back to me on?
Defining the problem as you see it.
Right.
I think we have to speak to whether or not China is the threat that it is often talked about as.
So I think China is certainly an element of it. I think there are other countries around the world as well, and particularly in East Asia, who have adopted aggressive policies to attract industries that they perceive as especially valuable. And so I think it was interesting, you know, when you were introducing the topic, you were sort of describing the case against industrial policy. One of the points was that we don't want to distort market signals. The reality is that we've already distorted market signals. Our approach to free trade that has said our market will include markets that are under the jurisdiction of aggressive industrial policies mean that our signals are distorted. You know, the cost advantage for semiconductor fabrication in East Asia, the BCG estimates about 70% of that is state policy. It has there's no comparative advantage there. It's public policy designed to attract that investment to those places. So I think certainly, you know, we are starting from a position where if we decide we will not have industrial policy, we are accepting the price distort, the wide variety of distortions and their consequences that have been introduced into the market. Now, is that a problem or not? I would say that it is. And I think you can see that broadly speaking, and then you can see that in case studies, whether you're looking at sort of, you know, renewable energy technologies, whether you're looking at semiconductors, you find that American manufacturers struggle to compete in them because there are other countries that have adopted public policies to attract the investment. So
Scott,
I guess we could throw it back and say, do we care? Or do we not care what we make or don't make here? But in my view, we do care.
Are our hands tied behind our back here?
Well, that reminds me of the argument that's been around for decades, and I couldn't really put my finger on why it was so frustrating, but you probably heard, do we care if we make potato chips or semiconductor chips and computer chips? And oh, you crazy libertarians don't care, is the criticism that many of the advocates of more government involvement would make. And I think the reasons that frustrated me so much is it's not necessarily an either or proposition that you choose one or the other, but it also really got to me because I like potato chips and I like Coca-Cola, I like Dr. Pepper, I like Ben & Jerry's, I like listening to Van Halen and watching Netflix and all these things that if you're an advocate of an industrial policy, it seems to me a logical, you would view these things not as economic benefits, but as economic costs, because all the resources are going into these consumer goods and not into the areas that somebody thinks that they should be going into. And that's one of the concerns that I have. But more generally, I don't want to allow this conversation to go off totally into a theoretical realm, because there was a reason I mentioned the sugar program and steel and aluminum tariffs, because I think from a practical standpoint, we're a democracy. And if you go down this road, whatever grand ideas somebody might have, the companies that benefit, the union workers that benefit, are going to be whoever has the most political clout, whether it's because they happen to be from Florida or Iowa, or they have the best lobbyists, or they spend the most money. And I think that is really the most likely result, in my opinion, based on U.S. history in going down this road.
And that's something I wanted to ask you, which is that the US government changes hands constantly, and we have a very divided country with very little sense of national unity or purpose or agreement on anything that matters in life, let alone what America's national goals are. How can we pursue a kind of common good policy around industry when we know whatever is implemented likely reflects somewhat partisan interests? And once a national industrial policy is implemented, it's going to be very hard to rein it in, whether it's warranted or not.
Well, I think there are obviously a large number of issues that we have partisan fights about, and they flip-flop back and forth every few years. And then we have a lot of issues where we actually have a great deal of consensus and consistent policy over very long periods of time. So I think the idea
What are
that
those?
A welfare state, public education, anti-discrimination provisions. I mean, everything that we take for granted today at some point in the past was an angry fight. And some of the things that we have angry fights about today, we will take for granted at some point in the future. So I think saying, well, we shouldn't try to develop a good strategy on some issue or make progress on it because it is futile and there will never be progress or good strategy on any issue is entirely self-defeating, and again, empirically unsupported. Not to mention, of course, that for the first 150 plus years of American history, you had very aggressive public policies, including aggressive protectionist measures that were well supported and maintained across administrations of both parties. You had, ambitious programs of the so-called American system to support domestic manufacturers. So, and for that matter, many of the other countries that do this very well are democracies too. So I don't see anything incompatible about it. I would also note that, the most recent, what I would say, vote we had on industrial policy on the American Foundries Act or the CHIPS Act, depending on which version you're talking about, last August, passed the Senate 96-4.
Mm.
So the the idea that there's nothing to build on here, I don't think is empirically correct. And while I'm happy to sort of have the kind of public choice debate about whether government can ever do anything well, I do think we should kind of at least wrap up the first piece of the discussion about whether there's anything here to be done well, because in my experience, the way these conversations go is we get to the point where, it sort of seems like actually, yeah, there are some problems and yes, public policy might address them. So then we just flip over to, well, but never mind, you can't do it because public policy doesn't work, which I don't think is true. And so I guess I'm actually very curious. I'm not clear from Brian's response what his view of the potato chips quote is. Is he a fan of computer chips, potato chips? What's the difference? Or does he, in fact, think public policy should distinguish between the two?
My criticism of that, obviously I agree there's a difference between the two, but my concern is the implication that you can have one or the other, but not both. I think the same thing that allows us to have a strong companies like Frito-Lay and companies like Pepsi are the same kinds of policies that will allow us to have strong semiconductor industry. Now, I'm probably a little bit different than Oren, which is most of the semiconductors, my understanding, are made in the US, Japan, Korea, Europe, and I'm really not too concerned if we buy our semiconductors from a resilient supply chain, whether it's Japan or Taiwan, and that means we're making something else in the United States. And we can, again, just try and dismiss this, but and I'm not sure, Warren, what you meant by the empirical history, because the empirical history to me is we pay twice the world price for sugar. And again, we'll just ignore that because we can have good public policy and somebody in DC is going to figure out which industry and which companies need subsidies and whether it should go to this, that, or the other thing. I obviously remain more skeptical about that. Not
like to
particularly skeptical, but I think based on the track record.
I want to bring Scott in here and also ground this in something practical. Oren made a good point there. So here, the Biden administration's commitment to green energy and development in the sustainability space. Scott, would you consider that to be along the lines of a national interest that checks a couple of different boxes between jobs and energy being reinvigorating the country and also taking on our foreign rivals in developing new things?
Yeah, certainly there's a perfectly libertarian free market view that protection of the environment, there is a role for the state. But this again goes back, not to sound like a broken record, to the difference between an industrial policy approach to that and what I would call a horizontal economic policy approach to that. The industrial policy approach kind of repeats what you said. We need specific green energy industries, manufacturing solar panels, batteries, EVs. We have to do this. We're going to do it through top-down economic interventionism, subsidies, tariffs, R&D tax credits, you name it. And we're going to do this to protect or to grow or have more American jobs. Now, that's the industrial policy side. My view is that's the side that I think creates all sorts of problems. I mean, you go back to when the Obama administration did a lot of green energy policy after in 2009 and 2010, and the Section 1705 loan program and all of these other DOE loan programs were rife with problems, not only failure to achieve their objectives, but breeding all sorts of cronyism and corruption, and really didn't actually produce a lot of successes in that space either. And if you want to go back to the Reagan era, we talked about automotive restrictions, the rest. Well, there are a lot of economic analyses of these programs, and they show they imposed far more costs than benefits, produce all sorts of distortions. U.S. semiconductor policy in the 1990s, for example, actually helped grow the Korean semiconductor industry while also benefiting our supposedly Japanese competitors. So when you go down these rabbit holes of trying to pick industries and trying to put your government's thumb on the scale for specific domestic production, you're going to end up not only with political problems, but all sorts of distortions and unintended consequences and additional costs. And I would add that unlike the private market, which certainly fails too, this is government allocating public resources. It is taking from taxpayers to fund specific objectives, often at the direction of political objectives and lobbying dollars, and not some grand national interest. It really sounds great. The national interest to support this. In reality, you end up with, well, stuff like the CHIPS program, which is going to put $50 billion not towards high-end bleeding edge chips, at least not now, but towards, first of all, legacy chips that automakers need, thanks to Senator Peters from Michigan inserting those billions. But also, there's no restriction on it going to kind of older chips. This isn't bleeding edge, cutting edge research. And that's, again, because it goes through the sausage making machine and ends up with something that's hardly what the textbooks promise us.
Are you looking at me, Stephen?
Looking at everyone. I just wanted to yield to you if you wanted to respond.
No, I feel like there's sort of maybe Brian is annoyed by potato chips, computer chips, because I use it constantly.
Go ahead.
Because I do look, I find it to be a fascinating litmus test. And, I think to some extent, I'll throw it kind of back to Brian and Scott. Obviously, yes, there is a difference between potato chips and computer chips. The question is, there a difference between us being really good at making computer chips and importing our potato chips, or us being really good at making potato chips and importing our computer chips? And I think the same sort of goes to Scott's point when he says he likes the horizontal policies, but not the vertical ones. Do we care whether or not we have a domestic industry that manufactures these renewable technologies that we apparently actually for environmental purposes do see value in adopting? I mean, these are sort of going back to your initial definition of industrial policy. These are sort of really core questions about how we define the national interest and how we understand economic prosperity. And one can take the position, look, it doesn't matter. Whatever investment the market allocates where, we'll just be good at doing that. But I think that's an unsustainable position. And I think if you acknowledge that actually there are some things that it is more useful than others to make, and that it is in the national interest to be good at making certain kinds of things, then that's a really important starting point for policy conversations. But I'm genuinely not pedantically not sure which side of that question they're on. So I'll throw it back over to them.
Well, my fear is that for an example, you might have a domestic semiconductor industry that's very strong and innovative and politically powerful, and goes to Congress and says, we need a bunch of money because China, or because of whatever. And I'm skeptical and cautious about the ability of the US Department of Commerce or Senate staffers or members of Congress to differentiate between what the country, what's in the best interest of the country, and the information that they're receiving from an industry that clearly stands to benefit. So it sounds like we're starting from the supposition of we're not going to have a semiconductor industry unless the government steps in and spends billions and billions and billions of dollars. That's certainly not true for most industries, most successful industries. Maybe the government's done some, been involved at the margins, but I would need to see more before I would be convinced, particularly with respect to semiconductors, but in general, that the government can do a good job of sorting these things out and can do a better job than the market can, just having seen too many examples based on companies with the political leverage and the access. You know, I once joked, if I were a lobbyist, I would say, here's whatever I want, whether it's semiconductors, money for education, whatever. And I'd say, because of China. And, you know, to some extent, I think that there are groups trying to take advantage of that. I'm sure they believe what is in their interest is in the country's interest as well. I don't mean to say they're not patriotic, but I remain skeptical.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to be the jerk in the debate, but I have to jump back in, and you haven't answered the question, Brian. The public choice issue is a fine one to raise, and we can get into it. But before that is the question: are computer chips different from potato chips? If you had, or put the other way, if you were convinced that our computer chip industry was in trouble, but we had a strong potato chip industry, would that matter? It's a really important sort of initial question about how we think about our economy and about prosperity. And I think you kind of have to have a point of view on it.
Yeah, but see, to me, Oren, you're making it sound like there's a choice. You can have one or the other, and that's
no. I'm not saying there has to be a choice. I'm saying would you be concerned? No, I'm saying, is there a problem if you see that we have a wonderful potato chip industry and no semiconductor industry? Is that an issue, or it just doesn't matter how much of one versus the other is getting made? Not to mention, in a world of limited resources, there are choices.
Yeah, so to me, those are hypotheticals, and I can go the other way, I think, and say, well, should we just shut down all the Pringles factories because those resources should be directed elsewhere? You know, I can't speak for everybody else, but again, yeah, we have a strong industry here, is my understanding of the data. I don't pretend to be an expert on the semiconductor industry. Scott probably has more statistics at his fingertips. And maybe we should be concerned about. I'm not concerned if we import a bunch of semiconductors or steel or aluminum from Canada or England or Korea. I think that's a great thing.
I mean, I'm an outsider on this debate here with the chips and the potato chips question. I mean, isn't it getting at potato chips are bringing value and enjoyment to individuals that's salty and delicious, and computer chips are increasing our geopolitical power and also making people money. Like, that's obviously better for the country than potato chips making individuals happy.
Right. And yeah, and I think that's where you need to start drawing lines. And in fact, I wrote a paper that was out in January, quick plug, exactly along these lines. I mean, I think that there is a legitimate free market argument that there are reasons for market interventions where national security is in play. And I mentioned the environment, I mentioned public health. These are things where these are classic examples of, look, there's a theoretical critical role for government there. Where things go off the rails is when you start talking about simple commercial advantages. For example, the United States government does not have a serious geopolitical, or I should say national security risk right now with respect to microchips. Outside of a couple 7-nanometer chips that are needed for a national lab, there is not a significant, we have a major semiconductor risk. And funding is not going towards that. What we're talking about with industrial policy, again, is not national defense. It is not in those areas. It's in commercial areas. And once you get out of the national security space and a couple of these other areas, then yeah, I don't think we should care. And why? Well, first, we have practical issues, right? Are we having a significant decline in manufacturing output or industrial capabilities? No. Are we having serious problems with R&D spending, or manufacturing investment? No. So beyond that, then we start going, but we're not getting exactly enough semiconductors, we're not getting exactly enough whatever. And once you start getting into those weeds, then that's not only where you run into all sorts of problems of trying to pick the right industry or trying to fund the right project, but you also run into all the public choice issues. You run into all of the seen and unseen cost issues. You run into distortions upon distortions. For example, a lithium mine in Nevada just got blocked because of the NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, and environmental litigation. We have Buy American rules and Davis-Bacon Act. We have the Jones Act. We have all sorts of things that get in the way of these types of picking winners and losers, these types of commercial interventions. Now, we might be willing to accept those costs in the strict national defense space. And I think that's, again, legitimate. But when we're talking about commercial production of bulk commodity chips for the automotive sector, yeah, count me out.
I'd like to spend the final 8 minutes talking specifically about nuclear energy. It can speak to a lot of different goals that industrialists have, whether it be fighting climate change, getting people more affordable energy, jobs in the middle of the country where these things are going to be built, and also research and development. Is nuclear energy and really leading the world in actually producing it and having it across the country a valid industrial policy, because it's going to have to involve the federal government to make it happen. Anyone take it? Oren, do you favor that project?
I'll say yes. And I think, it's the point Scott just made is actually one of my favorite points in this whole debate, which is that, we will hear about these sort of carve outs where action is warranted because it's for national security, let's say. And as soon as we agree that it's needed for national security, all of a sudden there's a concession that, in fact, public policy can work in advancing the goal, right? We don't hear, well, we shouldn't do national security or have, a defense industry or any of that because public choice is just going to be such a disaster. It's going to make it worse. In fact, once you concede there's an interest, then snap, suddenly the public choice concerns fall to the wayside and we're ready to move forward. And so, I think it's important to recognize that where we do realize there's a role for public policy, we generally do accept that it's going to be imperfect, but it's worth pursuing. And that's why I harp so much on this question of let's actually be specific on where we're going to acknowledge there is a public interest.
Scott, can you respond to that with a focus on nuclear energy?
Yeah, because I think there's a really huge difference, first of all, between national defense and commercial enterprise. But beyond that, no, I think that the public choice issues don't fall by the wayside when you talk about, for example, defense manufacturing. The difference is that we are willing to tolerate government's involvement there because, first of all, government is your sole demander of fighter jets. First of all, has unique knowledge in that area. But again, national defense is not just in the Constitution, but in longstanding, one of the primary roles of a national government, right? So that actually makes sense. So we're willing to tolerate the F-35s of the world because national defense is again, perfectly legitimate role for government. We're not, however, we shouldn't be, however, willing to tolerate the F-35 of the semiconductor world, because that's not, first of all, government acting in a traditional legitimate area, but also because those are things that the private market tends to handle really well without all of the unseen costs and all of the corruption and the rest that these targeted market interventions tend to produce.
And Stephen, in response to your nuclear question,
Yes, please.
I would look at that in terms of something like fracking, which was mainly market-driven, private sector innovation. I don't pretend to be smart enough to know whether nuclear energy is the future, or fusion, micro fusion is the future, or solar is the future, or wind industry is the future, despite the Jones Act, which makes it nearly impossible to build offshore wind factories. I don't know. I have no problems with the government funding some basic research and support in these areas. But I think, consistent with the other things I've said, would hate to see the government try and overly advantage or disadvantage one industry versus the other, except for legitimate national defense and environmental reasons, of course. But so I hope I didn't dodge your question totally there, but it's certainly an option that should be on the table. And if they can do a better job of providing energy more cheaply and efficiently, then more power to them. More power to them.
We have just a couple minutes left. I'd like to take a question from the audience here. Someone has asked, are there examples of successful reskilling programs for Native workers who may lose out from immigration and trade? Should policy even try to reskill workers? I feel like that fits into the context of education and industrial policy. Oren?
Well, I think there are effective programs, and they're almost always employer-led. I think that the government has a very effective role to play, sometimes in funding that, because employers, if you want them to invest in human capital, you typically need to make sure there's something in it for them as well as something in it for the worker.
But I thought the workers being educated was what was in it for them. If they needed it, they'd do it anyways.
Well, I mean, the funny thing about human capital theory is that either the value of the increased skills are going to go to the employer, or the value is going to go to the worker. If you want the value to go to the worker so that their higher productivity is captured by them in higher wages, then at the end of the day, not very much of it is going to go to the employer. And so I think the ideal model you have is one that certainly the employers know what skills they need. But if you want the result to be higher wages to the workers, I think you can't expect the employer to put up all the cost of it.
Scott, we have 2 minutes. You care to weigh in on that?
Well, no, I mean, I think that I actually tend to agree with Oren that employer-led reskilling is a perfectly fine thing to be out there. I guess I'll say it's fine. The issue, though, I have, and this again to pull it back to industrial policy, is I don't want government saying, but you can only do this for manufacturing. You can only do this for semiconductors. You can only do this for the targeted industries we picked. But to the extent that employers are out there trying to upskill workers, that strikes me as a net plus for all of us.
It seems inevitable that elements of the culture war would even creep into stuff like this. I could see Kamala Harris going out there and pushing some sort of national policy just to help subsidize getting women into STEM.
Well, look, you actually, you bring up a good point, because if you look at the Biden administration's brand new industrial policy manifesto on supply chain resiliency, there's all sorts of social objectives in there. It is not merely about having a world-class bleeding edge semiconductor industry. And that again gets back to the politicization, the inevitable politicization of these issues. It is not textbook, we're just going to establish or conquer this market failure. It inevitably gets into those more problematic things. And the culture war being, I think, a huge one right now.
Scott Lincecum, Brian Riley, and Oren Cass, thank you so much. Jared Labor of CKI, will hand the keys back over to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to Brian, thank you to Oren, thank you to Scott, and thank you, Stephen, for leading the conversation. Thank you to the audience for tuning in and listening to this important discussion. I've dropped all 4 of our speakers' Twitter handles into the chat. You should go and give them a follow on Twitter if you find yourself on that website from time to time. And thank you again for joining our panels. This is not meant to be the end of the conversation. This is meant to be the beginning. So as I said, follow all the speakers online, follow the Charles Koch Institute social media online, and we hope to see you everyone in future conversations about more important issues. Thank you, and everyone have a good afternoon.